Well, again, before we get to storytelling, I saw in the news last week that BlackRock, right, big equity for firm, for those listening know, big equity investment firm, biggest equity investment firm, and BlackRock has been a voice in the ESG space, especially their CEO writing letters and kind of a call to action. And this has been going on for a few years. He's been, timing them to Davos. I mean, it's been a very active kind of a, well, communication campaign, right? And I think some people just wonder, like, what's behind it? Is this an investment strategy? Is this a social conscious? Is this what's going on? But the reason I bring it up is last week, maybe you saw, he added very explicitly that now BlackRock was going to be looking very carefully at human rights, right? They'd really been kind of working climate change space of the ESG. And I think people understood that. Now with the new administration, there's a lot of interest again in trying to do climate change issues and all that. And so now the social. I just want to get your initial reaction of, like, that was a big wow moment, like that opens up a whole new market, or like people are going to be confused. Just what was your own reaction in terms of, like, kind of what that meant?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I always look out for Larry Fink's letters. I think that they really help to sort of, they're a bellwether, right, for where ESG is going.
Mhm.
And I thought it was really fascinating that the focus just last week is he's focusing more on human rights. And the reason I think it's so fascinating is because human rights is going to be a very dogged challenge for so many companies. One of the challenges that I think a lot of businesses face, especially if they're selling products, is the issue of supply chains. And in the U.S., it's one thing to have a voice on human rights, and that can mean something very specific domestically. But if you open that conversation up internationally, the global supply chain and the global picture on human rights is a very different story. And it's going to be a really pernicious challenge for companies, especially those who have vested interests and vested supply chains and investment in China, considering what's happening with the Uyghur population and the human rights abuses there that are so pervasive right now. Companies invest in their supply chains for the long term. And so to be able to extricate themselves and move manufacturing or production to another part of the globe that has better standards, that's a really hard thing to do. And I think that, look, I'm not an expert on ESG investments, but I wouldn't be surprised if the indices that are focused on ESG aren't going to be looking really deeply at some of these supply chains and some of the exposures that companies have there. So I think the fact that Larry Fink focused on this last week is going to really kind of open the floodgates at how we're looking at companies' global commitments to human rights.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. Of course, human rights has been around for such a long time. I'm old enough to remember when Jimmy Carter started making it, the flagship because of some of our past policies. But it has become very kind of institutionalized to the International Labor Organization. So if you're a corporation, it's like, well, what are we supposed to do? Okay, right, let's go look what those people say. But it does feel like that when it comes from someone like BlackRock, it's shaking things up. Like, you're just not going to be able to say, oh, no, we're great in human rights. It's like, oh, what do you mean by human, right? So it sounds like it'll cause tumbling and all that. Yep. And the only point I'll make about it for those listening, maybe new to ESG, I think it's a great example of how this investment side and this corporate responsibility side come together. Right, Lindsay, as you mentioned, terrible human rights experiences, right, in Western China with the Uyghurs and all that. So you might say, oh, that comes from the heart, right? We don't want to be investing in those things that cause that kind of human suffering. But at the same time, if you're investing, just to what you said, and you're investing in firms that are deeply embedded in those supply chains, your company's value is really at risk. And as an investor, you're going to want to hear some stories about how you're dealing with that risk.
Right.
So I just think it's a really good example how those two really kind of overlap and blend together. You know.